It's time for another episode of the Sean Tabbitt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Louis Markos, and we're going to be discussing his new book, From Aristotle to Christ: How Aristotelian Thought Clarified the Christian Faith. Louis, it's wonderful to have you again. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks. It's great to be back on. It's a good show. I love talking about this stuff.
Well, and it's always kind of funny for me. I get pitched so many different books every week, and this one came across my inbox from the publicist at InterVarsity Press. Like, oh man, that sounds really interesting. I'd love to have a conversation about that. And then when I was doing my prep, I realized you and I talked about a different book not too many years back. So I'm glad you're a return guest. I was happily surprised. Like, oh, we had such a good conversation last time. I know this conversation is going to be fantastic as well. But the place I always want to start, I know for some of my audience, this is their first time meeting you. So let's give them a bit of the Louis Markos origin story. I'd love to hear about church education background, like why you've been, reading dusty old books and teaching the things you teach. I remember from last time your origin story was fascinating. So share that with us again.
Well, great. Well, my name's Lou Markos, and that's Markos with a K. It's a Greek name. I grew up in New Jersey. I went to school in New York and then Michigan, and now I'm in the nice, warm Houston, Texas for 35 years. I think what makes me a little bit unique is that I grew up Greek Orthodox, and I came to know Jesus as my Savior in the Orthodox Church. But while I was in college, very much InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, small group Bible studies, slowly God moved me into the evangelical world, which is kind of odd, Sean, because a lot of my best students now are actually becoming Orthodox or Catholic, which is very, very odd. I've been a lot of change and dancing around, but in my case, the Lord moved me into the evangelical world. And I always had the love of Christ, of course, but I've always had the love of Greek mythology, Greek literature, Greek philosophy. I grew up with it as a Greek, but also I knew pretty early on I wanted to be an English professor. I double majored in English and history, and I still love history, but my deeper love is literature because of what literature tells us about humanity, about the human person, about who we are, why am I here, what is my purpose, how do I know my value, all the big questions. I've always wanted to ask those, and I've always wanted to bring together what does that mean, bringing Athens and Jerusalem together? It's one of the mission statements of my university, and it is that we want to bring together Athens, the Greco-Roman pre-Christian legacy, and we want to bring it together with Jerusalem, which is the Judeo-Christian legacy. And Aristotle is the end of a trilogy, from Achilles to Christ, looking at the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and the Greek tragedies, followed by Plato to Christ about 4 years ago, and now Aristotle to Christ. Though the book we discussed many years ago, The Myth Made Fact, also fits into this. See, I've always been passionate about this. When God chose to become man, right? What we call the incarnation, when God came into the world as one of us, he didn't do it randomly, Sean. He didn't, spin the globe and put his finger there. You always end up in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean when you do that anyway. He came during what's called the Pax Romana. Caesar Augustus becomes the first emperor, declares peace. That's the longest reign of peace the Western world has ever known. So Jesus came specifically at a time of peace and unity when it was safe to travel the Roman roads and to travel the waterways as well. But I believe, and I've always believed, that this concept of the fullness of time, that Jesus came at a specific moment, he came at a time when Greek thought was really undergirding. In fact, in the first century, it was actually Greek rather than Latin that was still the universal language because of Alexander the Great. And so kind of this is a good way to orient people, Sean. There was a guy named Socrates, right? The father of philosophy. He lived in the 5th century BC, the 400s. And he had a star pupil whose name was Plato. And Plato straddles the 400s and the 300s BC. But Plato had his own star pupil, and that's Aristotle, who is a 4th century, 300s BC figure. And Aristotle had a very famous pupil named Alexander the Great. A lot of people forget that. And when Alexander the Great sort of conquered the world, the Mediterranean world, what he did is he took that Hellenic thought coming down from Aristotle and spread it throughout the world. And that was still very much the culture that the Romans had adapted. I don't see this as a coincidence, right? God planned this. And I'll prove to you he planned it, Sean, because way back in the time of Daniel, you remember that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had a dream of a giant with a head of gold, breast of silver, the waist was bronze, and the legs were iron and clay. And it turns out that those four metals are four kingdoms, right? We've got the Babylonians, then we've got the Persians, then we've got the Greeks of Alexander the Great, and then we've got the Romans. And during that period, right, a stone uncut by human hands falls on the feet of the statue, crumbles it, but it turns into a mountain. So we have to understand this is very, very biblical, that God, only to the Jews did he speak directly, what we call special revelation. But God worked through the nations even when they didn't know. Sean, I know a lot of your listeners are Pentecostal or charismatic, and a lot of them say, and I say this too, that in some ways Donald Trump is Cyrus. Have you heard that argument? Right? Well, maybe he'll become a believer. He's not a believer yet, but still God uses him with all of his flaws, uses him to sort of get a country back on track. And I really do think this is the nature of our God. You see, Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament law and prophets, but I believe, as many others do, that he also fulfilled the highest yearnings of the pagan people. Everything comes together in Christ, not just the Old Testament, because he is the Jewish Messiah, but he's also the Savior of the world. And so it has been my life goal to figure out what it was in that ancient Greco-Roman culture that God wanted us to take and bring it up into this fusion, right? One more thing, and you can ask another question. Who was St. Paul? St. Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees, but he had a Greek education, and he was a Roman citizen. Paul is the new man. He is the fusion of Athens and Jerusalem, and I think we can learn a lot about Christ by looking at the way he prepared the world, even with pagans who did not know him.
Well, I'm curious, and this is a little off of where I plan to go, but just in terms of timing, would Aristotle have had any level of exposure to what we would now talk about as Old Testament scriptures? Would that have?
I don't see any evidence of that. I mean, I know people, for instance, have wondered about the Magi who somehow found their way to the Christ child. Maybe Daniel left behind, but there's really no evidence of that. And the same thing with Plato and Aristotle. I mean, there were some early evangelists like Justin Martyr who suggested maybe the Greeks read Moses somehow. But again, the point is, even though that's theoretically possible, the important point is it's not necessary, because through what we call general revelation, God speaks to us through creation, through conscience, through reason, through imagination. And so, again, we can figure things out, but we're only saved by Christ. I mean, when the Magi got to the Christ child, they could have said, that's it, I'm leaving, this is ridiculous. But they recognized that this was the Christ, and they not only gave gifts, but they worshiped the baby. Just like Cornelius, who was a Roman centurion. He couldn't have guessed the gospel, but when it was presented to him, he was ready for it. And he said it was the gospel that saved him. But he was able to move towards it so that the acceptance of Christ does not need to be a leap into the void. It can be a step of faith. Reason has brought me to the threshold, but still, it is the faith that saves. But reason can bring us there.
And I'm curious, like what can we say was Aristotle's view of God? Would he have been more view of gods as we maybe see in more Roman or Greek context, or did he have any kind of a concept of like a kind of solo kind of God idea?
It really is clear to me that Plato and then Aristotle are moving towards a kind of monotheism. They don't know Yahweh from the Old Testament, but they are starting to understand that if there's going to be a God, he needs to be a standard a standard of ethics, a standard of right and wrong. And especially for Aristotle, he knew that for this world to work, this universe, this cosmos to work, it needs a beginning and it needs an unmoved mover. That was what Aristotle called God. He does not move himself, but he sets everything into motion. Now, that's not Christianity, right? Because our God is a personal triune God. But there's no way that Aristotle could have known that apart from direct revelation from the prophets, the Old Testament, the New Testament. But human reason allowed him to see that there must be one God. And Sean, a lot of us don't realize this. We have been so influenced by evolution that we forget evolution is not just this crazy scientific theory. It affects every area of life. So a lot of us have taken for granted that, man, we started as crazy animists running around with spirits, and then we worked our way up to pantheism, and then polytheism, and then monotheism, and then, of course, science, right? No. According to the Bible, we all started as monotheists, and then we fell away into idolatry. So I do think that there is a primal memory of the one God, because in the beginning, we were all monotheists. And there's a great book called Eternity in Their Hearts by Don Richardson, where he discovered isolated tribes in Asia and Africa that still remembered monotheism, but they were terrified and they were trapped by the demonic spirits that held them in fear. So there is, again, I think there's the possibility of moving logically. Again, that logic doesn't save us, but moving logically towards an understanding of what there must be. He used his logic to try to figure out how everything works together. You see, my Plato book, the subtitle is How Platonic Thought Shaped the Christian Faith. For this book, How Aristotelian Thought Clarified the Christian Faith. Because what Aristotle did is he gave us a language. He gave us a vocabulary, categories. He gave us logic, a system, a way to put together our thoughts in a rational way. And that, I mean, that undergirds science and all other things, but it also undergirds Christianity as a system, as a coherent worldview with terminology and things like words like Trinity. He didn't invent the word Trinity, but helps us to think in logical categories, which are important. The emotion is important too, but we need the logical, just like I need my skeleton. If all I was flesh, I would be a jellyfish. But I need that skeleton, and Aristotle helped give us a vocabulary of a skeleton. Then we can add the flesh and all the beautiful things. That's the emotional side. But we need both if we're going to have a strong church and a strong doctrine.
Well, the question I want to ask, like the thing that it first makes me think of is like, back in Bible college, learning Hebrew and Greek for the first time, how the Bible suddenly came alive in new ways I'd never seen before. And yet, here we're talking about that, Aristotelian thought, it has clarified the Christian faith. I know there are those in our various Christian circles who like, I got the Bible. That's all I need. I need nothing else. And they're either offended by or scared of this idea that outside ideas, sometimes non-Christian ideas per se, shape some of our thought. Like it makes people really nervous. So,
It does.
you've already pitched me on why it's a win. Should we be scared of it? Should we be afraid of it? Because I could find a bunch of people who'd be like, "This is a bad idea. We just need the Bible and nothing else. Why is this a good idea?"
The Bible is the only book we need, okay? It will show us salvation, how to live the Christian life. But really, there's a lot of things we don't need. None of us needs a college education. Most of us could actually get by without a high school education. So the early fathers and the medieval fathers always reminded us how Joseph and Moses were educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and used that wisdom to serve the one true God. Daniel was educated in the wisdom of first the Babylonians and then the Persians. A little bit earlier, remember, Moses is overwhelmed. How am I supposed to judge all these people? And he went to get advice from his pagan father-in-law named Jethro. And Jethro taught him, this is in Exodus, taught him, delegate, delegate, delegate. And Moses learned that wisdom from him. A metaphor that a lot of, including Augustine, a lot of early fathers used was, you might remember this, as the Jews were leaving Egypt, God told them to have your wives go to the Egyptians and ask them for their gold and their jewelry. And thus they despoiled the Egyptians, right? They plundered the Egyptians. And they used that to build the temple. Now, they also used some of it for the golden calf. That's why there always has to be discernment. We have to be careful. Right? There's a difference. Like, let me just make it clear, okay? I read the Greek myths. I learn from, but I've been a Christian for a long time and I've got some spiritual maturity. I would never participate in a seance. I would never use a Ouija board, Sean. I would never, because the devil does have power. You don't mess with that sort of stuff. But here's something very important. A lot of your listeners might remember in the book of Acts, it starts with these 7 sons of Sceva, these Jewish guys who do not know Christ. And they start trying to perform exorcisms. And they say, in the name of this Jesus that Paul, preaches, we cast you out. What do the devils say? I know who Paul is, and I know Jesus. Who are you? And they go running out naked, right? Well, again, be careful. Don't mess with things. But it then says, a great awe fell over the people, and they all gathered together their books and burned them. Now, very important. They are not burning the Iliad, the Odyssey, Plato, Aristotle. What they are burning, it's very clear in Acts, they're burning books of spells. In other words, the use of what we might call black magic, where you're trying to gain power and dominion, as a witch doctor does, as a voodoo person does. That is not what we're talking about. That is something we need to avoid. We have to be careful. What's it? Not Samuel. Saul learned the hard way when he went to the medium of Endor and called back Samuel. He learned the hard way. You don't do that. Okay, God is against that. But what we're talking about here is very different. We're not talking about spells. We're not talking about the attempt to control. We're talking about how God used even pagan people to prepare the individual nations for the full revelation of Christ. And look, I wrote Plato to Christ and Aristotle to Christ because I'm a man of the West. I would like to see a good Chinese Christian write from Confucius to Christ, because I believe now it's a little bit more difficult when you say Muhammad to Christ, because Muhammad is after the Bible and is twisting the Bible, okay? But things that are before the Bible, right, that God is using, I really think if we look hard enough, we will find evidence of God's work in every nation. That did not save them, but it prepared the way for the more we study this, the more we look. I don't know about you, Sean, but I love listening to people give testimonies who have strong, thick accents. Why? Because it reminds me that Christ is the Savior of the world. And it's amazing the different ways God calls people to himself out of all these very different cultures. And so God does work, just like he works through nature, he works through this literature and this philosophy and this history.
Well, and with a book as expansive as yours, with all the topics you cover, we can never get into everything. I always say, if you want the whole story, you're going to have to read the book. So, but we're going to touch on a couple of the core sections. There's one section of the book titled "How to Read the Heavens and the Earth." How does Aristotle contribute to our ideas around cosmology and how we understand the heavens and the earth?
It's a beautiful word, isn't it? Cosmology, the study of the cosmos. And by the way, cosmos is the same Greek root as cosmetics. Now, what do cosmetics and cosmos have in common? Because cosm means ornament. Just like cosmetics is the ornament you put on the face, the cosmos is the ornament of God. The cosmos shows forth the beauty, the balance, the harmony of our God. The heavens are telling the glory of the Lord. The skies are proclaiming his handiwork. That's Psalm 19, showing how God shows forth his glory even in his creation. In fact, many early Christians referred to the two books, the book of the Bible, that's special revelation, and the book of nature. God speaks through, as he spoke through the Star of Bethlehem, signaling the birth of his son, as he used an earthquake and an eclipse of the sun to mark the crucifixion. So we look for that. So anyway, Uh, I just forgot what the question was.
Oh, Aristotle's influence on
Oh, yeah, thank you.
cosmology, how we read the heavens and the earth.
I was getting very excited on the cosmology. So he helped give us an ordered view of the world that had a profound influence on Dante and other people. Now, this may sound weird. Why should we study Aristotle since it turned out he was wrong? Aristotle put the earth at the center. He didn't put the earth at the center because he was stuck up and thought we were super special. Put the earth at the center because it made the most sense of observation. Remember, before Galileo, there are no telescopes to allow us to make more precise prediction. There were people in the ancient world, Sean, who suggested a heliocentric or sun-centered model, and it was rejected because it didn't explain things as well as the earth-centered. Now, everybody knows about gravity. That word comes later, but Aristotle knew things fell. As a good scientist, he tried to come up with a reason, and he said, we need an earth at the center because everything falls to the center. Now, there are certain things, fire and air, that move away from the center, but other things like earth and water, they move towards the center. It is an attempt to make sense of the world. And even though we now disagree with some of his teachings, we never could have done that if we didn't use his methodology of observation and figuring out what it meant. Sean, I don't know if you've read these books, but people have shown pretty conclusively, why is it that science, as we know it, modern science, the scientific method, why did it spring up in the West and not in the East, right? The Chinese and Indians invented things long before we did in the West, but they did not invent science because their view of the world is that it was illusion. It's only because the early scientists were Christians, and some were just strong theists, but most were Christians. They expected to find balance and beauty in the world. And actually, Aristotle also taught them that there's order and balance. And you see, you've heard that phrase, nature abhors a vacuum. Well, actually, that's not true. But Aristotle believed that, and that's why everything pushed everything else. He had a universe that made sense. And again, what he taught us is something that's native to mankind is the desire to study. You probably heard of intelligent design, and there was a great book called The Privileged Planet. It's not only that our solar system is exactly designed to allow human life, it's also designed to allow us to study the stars. If it wasn't our position, if it wasn't our atmosphere, we couldn't study anything. People on Venus could not study the universe. But we kept suggesting that God wants us to use our brains to study and grow and explore. And there's such a beauty to Aristotle. And even if it's not true today, there's a beauty to it that reminds us that we live in a meaningful, balanced, purposeful universe. And that's vital. That's vital. And a lot of people are hungry for that again.
Well, and that's an intriguing thought, contrasting why the scientific method appeared in the West versus the East. But I feel like that's an illustration of worldview matters. Our
Yes.
theology, all our other ideas about how we make sense of the world directly influences the thing, not only what we think and believe, but the things we do, the things we make, the things we create.
Yeah.
Any commentary you'd like to give on that?
Yeah.
Worldview matters.
I mean, it really does. I mean, the idea that not only is our world meaningful, but that we can trust our senses to study it is part of the Christian worldview. And it's kind of there in Plato and Aristotle as well. Also, what Plato and Aristotle taught us is what seems counterintuitive, that sometimes the unseen things are more real than the seen things. That's very Judeo-Christian as well. And they know that because of direct revelation from God. But people like Plato and Aristotle were able to, so to speak, figure it out by really thinking, what is the nature of reality? The unseen things that are eternal, aren't they more real than our shadowlands? As C.S. Lewis said, we're living in the shadowlands. And that doesn't mean our world is unreal, but in comparison to the thundering reality of heaven, it is like living in the shadowlands.
Well, I think the last place I'd like to go before we have our final wrap up questions What is Aristotle's contribution to our ideas around how do we get along with our neighbors? Like we
Sure.
always say, oh, love your neighbor as yourself. If I had $1 for every time I've heard that throughout my Christian life, I could probably
Yeah.
retire now. But how does Aristotle contribute to some of our ideas of neighbors and community?
If you're only going to read one book by Aristotle, it has to be the Nicomachean Ethics. And by the way, if you read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, book one is an argument for theism, for God. Book two is an argument for Christianity. But book three is about how do you live the Christian life. And Lewis quotes Aristotle almost as much as the Bible because Aristotle got it right, right? Now, our ethical behavior doesn't save us, right? But we want to live ethically and virtuously. And Aristotle got us thinking about virtue and got us thinking about the choices we make. And Aristotle, Lewis clarifies this himself in Mere Christianity. Virtue, he said, is the mean between the extremes. Courage is the mean, the middle point between a lack of courage, cowardice, and an excess of courage, impulsiveness, conkiness, right? No. The berserker that runs in and kills everybody, that's not courage, that's stupidity. Courage is in the middle, right? And it's very important that, see, because Christianity is, there are do's and don'ts in Christianity. Obviously, there's this thing called the Ten Commandments. But ultimately, virtue, beyond just simple do's and don'ts, virtue means aligning ourselves with reality. That's what changes us from within. And as Christians, we need Aristotle to remind us that virtue is not a feeling, virtue is an action. And virtue is an action that if we do it enough, it will become a habit. Then you will become a virtuous person. Look, the virtue of courage doesn't mean I feel brave. The virtue of courage means even when I'm terrified, I stick to my post and do my duty. But the beauty thing, you might have heard the phrase virtue is its own reward. The more you practice virtue, the more you will enjoy virtue, right? The more you practice Christian charity, the more you will enjoy charity because it will change you. Look, Aristotle could have helped write the movie Fireproof. Do you remember that movie?
Oh yeah.
And the guy who loses his wife, and so somebody gives him a love dare. Spend the next 30 days treating your wife as if you love her, and then the feelings of love will return. Now, a lot of Americans would think that's hypocritical and phony. It's not. It's the way we are built. Our habits should drive our emotions and not vice versa. And we need to be reminded of that. This is particularly a problem of white Christians. And when I say white, I don't mean myself as a Greek. I mean the British and the Germans and the Scandinavians. It all goes back to Kant. This idea that something is not really virtuous if you're enjoying. It's a terrible thing that comes from Kant. The idea that if I'm enjoying my charity, then it's not really charity, then it's not really duty. That is such a falsehood. And maybe we need Aristotle to help remind us that no. If you truly practice charitable activity, it will change you so that you will enjoy charity. So again, I think that's a good place to start. Now, I don't want to forget to say this to your listeners. Aristotle's a bit harder to understand than Plato. Part of the reason is we don't actually have anything that Aristotle wrote down himself. I want you to, a modern analogy. Imagine if I had given a lot of lectures and I had produced some PowerPoints, and then I died without writing it down. And my students took my PowerPoints and turned it into a book. It would be my thought, but it would be a little choppy, right, Sean? There wouldn't be as many examples or illustrations. That's what makes Aristotle hard. It's more like the facts, and there's not as much beauty to it. Like Plato writes these dialogues that are so entertaining. Aristotle is not as entertaining, but I think you will enjoy his ethics. You will enjoy his politics and his poetics. I think are the most accessible. And I start with the hard stuff, the logic and the physics and the science, and then I move into things like, and I'll tell you one last thing. One of the most important things that Aristotle taught us is this word telos or telos, Telos. what that means is every person, everything in the world has a telos, which means a purposeful end. We have to understand what our end is. You've probably heard of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. It asks, what is the chief end of man? What is the telos of man? To worship God and enjoy him forever. Right? Aristotle said the chief end of man is happiness, not like ha happiness, but a happiness that is like the peace that Jesus gives, a happiness that allows you to contemplate. And the reason why you want a democracy is to allow for more leisure, to allow for more contemplation, and to allow for more happiness. So again, those are some of the things that we really owe to Aristotle.
And in terms of your own journey, researching, pulling this book together, I always like to ask almost every author this question: was there anything new or surprising you encountered along the way? Anything that you weren't expecting?
Well, Aristotle is dry, okay, but when you really dig into it, and if you work hard, because you have to work hard, you will see that there is excitement because it's the excitement of learning. It's the excitement of thinking. It's the excitement of making sense of the world, which is unique. My university has a big push of metacognition. I don't know if you've heard that word, Sean. Metacognition means thinking about thinking. And that's what Aristotle did. He didn't just think, he thought about. Why do we say the Greeks are the beginning of sort of humanism? Well, look, the Egyptians knew that if you had a 3-inch piece of string and a 4-inch and a 5-inch, it would give you a right angle, 90-degree, which you need to build things like pyramids. But it was the Greeks, starting with Pythagoras, who looked at that and thought about thinking and said, no, it's not just those strings. In any triangle, even the one you can't see, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That's what Aristotle, he's thinking about things. He didn't invent virtuous behavior, but he's thinking about virtue. And you know what? Our legal system is based on two things. One, it's very much based on the Old Testament, on particularly Deuteronomy and all those things, but it's also based on Aristotle. Aristotle helped us to understand the difference between first and second and third degree murder. He helped us to understand the importance of motivation to what you're doing. He really gives us a kind of clarity that allows us. And again, a lot of democratic ideas go back to Aristotle in his Politics and the way he tries to arrange a city-state, a polis that will allow for the maximum freedom. Very, very important. One last thing he said is that the state doesn't create the family creates the state. We need to remember that today, Sean, okay? That the family is the primary unit out of which everything else grows. The Greek word for the family as a unit was oikos, not the yogurt, but oikos, which is where we get the word oikonomics, economics. The original economics is the household as an economic unit making things, right? Cottage industries, we say today. And from there, it expands and grows. And again, Aristotle helps us to understand that, gives us a language to show the movement from the family to the village, to the town, to the city.
And in terms of, say, the reader's journey with the book, they put in the time, they close that back flap. Like, what's that enduring thread, that core message? Like, man, if everybody sees this in the book, I've been successful.
I just want them to see that there is a joy in learning and wisdom, and that God has given us the ability to think about thinking, to stand outside and analyze and look, and that we as Christians can learn from non-Christian writers, that they can guide us in the right direction. It's ultimately the Holy Spirit that does it, okay? But that, again, if we're going to reach out and build bridges to non-believers, especially today, I don't know if you know this, Sean, but the new atheists are really dead. The new challenge to the Christian is a resurgence of the New Age. People that are hungry for spiritualism, and that's good, but we have to find a way to connect with them. to be able to see it from their point of view, while we maintain our discernment, but to see it from their point of view. And so I want people to read this book and the Plato book, the Aristotle book, the Achilles book, to understand how, again, I come not to break the law, but to fulfill it. And again, he fulfilled as well the great thinking of an Aristotle.
Well, I like what you said earlier about, we need to certainly avoid things like Ouija boards and
Yes.
seances and whatnot. But I would liken it to my work in the near death experience space. There are some conferences and events centered around NDEs that are very secular and new age. You're going to have keynote speakers who are psychics or mediums talking about how they help people connect with their deceased loved ones. And, next door you might have one of my friends giving a very Jesus centric
Oh, yeah. That's right.
testimony about their heaven experience. And so, kind of that idea of, can you be all things to all people and represent Christ, even in those sometimes dark spaces, keeping yourself separate, but also being salt and light in those places and bringing the gospel. It's a balance,
It
but
is a
I feel like
balance.
that's what Jesus calls us to do. But we're often afraid of those dark places.
Yeah, and again, my books are trying to train you to be able to think in that way. Somebody blew my mind, and it sounds like you're into this stuff, Sean. What about these alien abductions? Okay, what's interesting about alien abductions is that there is absolutely no scientific evidence for it, but there is incredible psychological evidence. People, do therapy, and it's like that person had that experience. I know there's absolutely no proof of that, and finally, I think that a lot of the aliens are demons. And what that means is that the aliens are not demons. It's that demons are getting a foothold in us through our fear of the alien. And the proof of that is, and you've probably heard the testimonies of people who were, living in fear because they kept seeing the little alien guy. And then they became Christians. And when they saw the alien, they rebuked it in the name of Christ, and it was gone. Okay, so obviously it is a demonic thing. So, but I think again, we have to be able to think outside the box using our discernment to understand. I will tell you, a lot of people don't understand with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has a system that I think we as evangelicals can learn from. If I'm a Catholic and I go and I say I think this was a miracle, the Catholic Church will investigate it and rule out all scientific explanations. If there is no sign, then they will call it a miracle. If I say, I think my daughter is possessed, they won't immediately do an exorcism. They will first rule out chemical imbalance, all that other. And then if there is simply no, quote, rational explanation, then we can do an exorcism. And I think we do need to train our mind to learn to think in that way, to use the reason that God has given us. And nobody straightens out the mind like Aristotle. I tell you, it's hard, but he does it.
Well, and I love that you brought up the alien abductions. In my most recent book, it's called the NDE conspiracy. I have a whole
Ooh.
chapter looking at alien abductions because in the conference speaking kind of circuit spaces where people talk about NDEs, alien abductions are very popular
Yeah.
as a topic of discussion of like how much are they like near death experiences because it's somebody who's going on what they describe as a travel journey of I was here, I was taken up into this other place, I met otherworldly beings, I had these experiences,
Yeah.
and then I returned and it impacted me. And so, in many ways, it has a lot of similarities to a near death experience, but it is fascinating the many testimonies that are out there. So many of them, when people cry out to Jesus, even in the midst of the abduction experience, it stops, like it just shuts down. And so I feel
Yeah.
like I agree with you that really points to that the roots of that is it's some kind of a demonic manifestation. Why that person stepped you into a space in their life experience where that happens, you'd have to look at their history and what they were
Right. Some kind of
involved in and all
trauma.
those things.
Yeah.
But so and, again, books like yours encourage me that believers can think deep thoughts, but also bring rational
Right.
ideas into spaces that are very squishy. People are open to new age ideas and
Yeah.
other things because they're hungry for the spiritual. Even
Yes.
just to talk about NDEs for just one more moment. People are often drawn to this space because they've lost a loved one. Somebody passed
Yes.
away, and they want assurance that their loved one, their friend, whoever it was, that they're in heaven, they're on the other side. And so you'll have people who start searching on YouTube or Google, having
Right.
stories, having experiences, and it's kind of a 50-50 chance where
Mhm.
sometimes the algorithm might serve up me and some of my friends talking to a near-death experiencer about a heaven experience that's very Jesus-centric, and
Right.
another, the next search, they may get a psychic or medium talking about how they help people reconnect with their loved ones, and,
Yeah.
the algorithm, can lead one person towards heaven and the other person
Right.
towards hell, and so, some of these ideas and how we deal with them, people's eternal lives are actually in the balance. That's the more I've worked in this space, the more I've seen, like, something like even like a conversation like we're having can totally steer somebody towards the Lord and in a new direction. And
Yeah.
so even podcast conversations are important. God
Yeah.
uses them in ways we'd never imagine.
Well, I tell you, I think the most important thing that the new ager needs to know is that if something is spiritual, it is not necessarily good. That is the biggest deception. If it's spiritual, it has to be angels. Well, there's also devils, right? So spiritual can be good or bad. By the way, do you think that when Paul was taken up to the third heaven, do you think that might have been a near death experience?
Abs-
I wonder because
Absolutely.
remember in Lystra he was stoned and left for dead, and I've always wondered if that's when he had a near death experience because that's what it sounds like. By the way, Plato wrote a book called The Republic, and it ends with something called the myth of that is literally a near death experience. Whether
Yeah.
Plato, I don't know.
Yeah, I even get that into the NDE experience as well as just looking at ancient near death experiences that people sharing these accounts. Like, it's not a modern thing. People have been recording near death experiences for many
Yeah.
thousands of years. But I do touch on Paul briefly in the book, in that I do think he had a near death experience, even though he's like, hey, I knew a guy. This
Oh
thing
yeah.
happened to him. But I think Paul would have struggled with some of the same things people struggle with today. That if you're the guy who had the near death experience, sometimes people treat you weird. Sometimes
Yeah.
people treat you different. So there can be kind of a stigma sometimes
Yeah.
around that kind of a testimony. But,
Well,
you know,
I've had, yeah,
go
I've had a lot of people share with me their NDEs because they know I'm not going to laugh at them. There's a lot of people that have them. I'm not going to laugh. Tell me, and you know what I always tell them though? I said, don't tell me anything if God told you not to tell. Because remember what Paul says. I saw things that I'm not allowed to. So I don't want you telling me forbidden knowledge. But other than that, please go ahead and share. And of course, as we know, there are more NDEs today because we've gotten better at reviving people, right? So you're going to have more of that today, I think, than in the past.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. Resuscitation techniques
yeah.
certainly have improved over the last, and I would say over the last 50 years, it's been a stable part of the regular conversation, largely due to
Yes.
Raymond
That book,
Moody's book, Life After
Moody,
Life. He coined the
that
phrase
started
near
it.
death experiences, and kind of from Moody forward, you've had
Yeah.
this whole movement, both on the secular and religious side, to study and kind of track and really to try to make sense of what our near death experience is. We got off track about NDEs, but hey, that's a huge part of
That's
my life. I
okay.
love to talk about
We're
those.
thinking. We're thinking it. We're thinking about things.
Thinking
I'll end with a
critically.
really funny story. I remember when I was a kid watching a show called That's Incredible. And one time they brought somebody on who had had a near death experience where he went to hell, because that happens sometimes. And so they listened to the man's story and they made this video of somebody going down into the darkness and seeing these shrouded figures. And as I'm watching it on the screen, something pops up and says, "This is a simulation." And I thought, really? Do you think I'm that stupid that I thought he brought a camera with him? I don't know if I want to watch this show anymore if they think their audience is that stupid. But I mean, it's been with us, and we have questions. I mean, we remember the caution, of course, of the rich man and Lazarus, that there is a gulf between us. I mean, there's certain things, but it's the Bible doesn't tell us as much as we'd like to know, and we should seek out, but again, always with caution and discernment,
Yeah.
because we can be deceived.
Yeah, caution and discernment is always a good rule when we're taking in spiritual things, listening to spiritual stories or testimonies, because again, something can easily point us away from Jesus, even though it sounds pretty good. It has just enough truth. Some of these stories
Right.
to be deceiving. Lewis, in terms of people finding out about your many books, all the things, where are the best places for us to discover you on the web?
I mean, the best place, just go to Amazon.com, type in Louis Markos, Markos. I've published 30 books now, Sean. I've been really busy. They're all up there. Also, if you go to YouTube and type in my name, I have a YouTube channel. If you want to listen, a bunch of them, Sean, I have amassed because I filmed a lot of it during COVID. I thought, well, let's not waste it. At least I can do some teaching. But that's the best way to get a hold of me. All the books are on Amazon.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes. On the one hand, to Lewis's YouTube page, as well as links to where you can pick up your very own copy of this new book. Sadly, it's time to bring this episode of the Sean Tabbitt Show to a close. We're having so much fun today. But thanks for being a part of my conversation today with Louis Markos. Once again, our book today was From Aristotle to Christ, How Aristotelian Thought Clarified the Christian Faith. And Louis, I want to say thank you so much for pouring into us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you back in the show.
Thanks for having me on.